The note was tucked between pages 97 and 98 of a worn library copy of Walden, folded so precisely that Clara Davenport almost missed it when she checked the book back in. Her fingers, practiced from 20 years of handling thousands of volumes, felt the slight irregularity in the spine. She opened to the marked page, and there it was. A single sheet of paper, covered in careful handwriting, the English words, formed with such deliberate precision that she knew immediately who had written it. Friedrich Weber, the German prisoner who had borrowed more books than any other man in Camp Algona. The enemy soldier who had sat at her library tables for 18 months, reading with an intensity that reminded her of students preparing for the most important examination of their lives, the man whose people had killed her fiancé on a beach in Normandy. She unfolded the note with trembling hands, and as she read the first line, everything she thought she knew about hatred, forgiveness, and the power of words began to shift. But to understand why that note mattered, why it would ripple through her small Iowa town and eventually across an ocean, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the autumn of 1943, when enemy soldiers first walked through the doors of the Algona Public Library, and Clara Davenport faced an impossible choice between her grief and her principles. Algona, Iowa, population 5,412, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. A farming community in the heart of Kossuth County, where corn stretched to the horizon, and the biggest excitement most weeks was the Friday night high school football game. The library sat on the corner of Main Street in Thorington, a modest brick building donated by the Carnegie Foundation back in 1913. Clara had been its head librarian since 1935, a position she'd earned through sheer stubbornness and a collection of degrees that baffled most of the town council. Why a woman needed that much education to lend out books was beyond them, but they couldn't deny she ran the place with flawless efficiency. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Within months, Algona's young men were streaming into recruitment offices. Clara's fiancé, Thomas Mitchell, enlisted in the Army the day after the attack. Her younger brother, James, joined the Marines 3 months later. By the spring of 1942, every family in town had someone in uniform. The Gold Star flags began appearing in windows that summer. Mrs. Henderson's boy killed in the Pacific. The Olsen twins, both lost at Guadalcanal. Thomas fell at Normandy in June of 1944, though Clara wouldn't know about the note by then. She learned about his death through a telegram delivered to the library on a Tuesday afternoon, the words swimming before her eyes as patrons pretended not to notice her, standing frozen behind the circulation desk. But before Thomas died, before Clara knew what it meant to hate the enemy with personal fury, the government made a decision that would transform Algona forever. They were going to build a prisoner of war camp just outside of town. A big one of the largest in the entire United States. Camp Algona would eventually hold over 10,000 German prisoners captured from Rommel's Afrika Korps in Tunisia, from the Italian campaign, from the beaches of France. The first prisoners arrived in the summer of 1943, and suddenly Algona found itself hosting hundreds of enemy soldiers who would work the surrounding farms, keeping Iowa's agricultural economy running while American boys fought overseas. The town's reaction was exactly what you'd expect: fury, fear, resentment. These were the men who had been killing their sons, brothers, and husbands. Now they were here, walking American soil, breathing American air, eating American food. The camp itself was built quickly, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers sprawling across acres of farmland. The prisoners wore uniforms with PW stenciled on the back in large white letters. They were transported to work sites in trucks, always under armed guard, always watched. But they were here, visible, human, and that humanity made everything more complicated. The controversy began in October of 1943 when the camp's commanding officer, Colonel Stanley Miller, approached the town council with an unusual request. He wanted to allow some of the prisoners, the educated ones, the officers and former professionals, supervised access to the public library. It was part of a broader policy, he explained. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners of war, Educational opportunities were encouraged. Books could keep the men occupied, reduce discipline problems, and frankly, show these Germans that America was exactly what it claimed to be, a nation that valued knowledge, freedom, and human dignity, even in wartime. The town council meeting that night packed the courthouse. Clara attended, sitting quietly in the back row, listening to neighbors shout at each other with a passion usually reserved for discussions about property taxes or road maintenance. Harold Jensen, whose son was fighting in Italy, stood and declared that giving books to Nazis was a betrayal of every American soldier. Margaret Hoffman, the mayor's wife, argued that if we abandoned our principles out of hatred, we were no better than the enemy we fought. Reverend Thomas Clayton reminded everyone that even enemies were children of God, a statement that earned him hostile glares from half the room. Colonel Miller remained calm throughout the chaos. He cited regulations, explained protocols, and made his case with military precision. The prisoners would come in small groups, never more than 10 at a time. Armed guards would be present at all times. The prisoners could only borrow books approved by the camp's intelligence officers, nothing that could be used for propaganda or escape planning. They would come on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when the library was typically quiet. The whole program could be canceled immediately if any problems arose. Then someone asked the question that mattered most. Who would be responsible for supervising this at the library? Who would interact with these prisoners, hand them books, check materials in and out, stand face to face with the enemy? Every head in that courthouse turned to look at Clara Davenport, because everyone knew there was only one person who could make this work. The librarian who had memorized every book in that building, who could recommend the perfect volume for any reader, who believed with almost religious fervor that books could change lives. The same woman whose fiancé was, at that very moment, training for the invasion of France. The woman who would have more right than anyone to refuse. Clara felt those stares like physical weight. Her hands gripped the wooden pew in front of her until her knuckles went white. She thought about Thomas writing her letters from England about the upcoming invasion, about his hope that when the war ended, they could finally start their life together. She thought about her brother James, somewhere in the Pacific, fighting men who wore different uniforms, but shared the same ideology as these Germans. She thought about her father, who had fought in the First World War and came home with lungs scarred by gas, spending his final years coughing through nights while her mother wept in the kitchen. But she also thought about what her father had told her before he died. He'd made her promise something that seemed strange at the time. Promise me, Clara, that you'll never let hate make you small. Never let it narrow your world. That's what war does if you let it. It makes everything smaller, makes you forget that most people on both sides are just trying to survive, caught up in things bigger than themselves. She stood. The courthouse went silent. In a voice that shook only slightly, Clara said she would do it. She would supervise the prisoners' library visits, not because she forgave them for this war, not because she didn't understand the pain everyone in that room carried, but because she believed that books were sacred. That knowledge should not be a weapon we withheld, but a light we offered, even to those who dwelt in darkness. If these German boys, and yes, she called them boys because that's what most of them were, wanted to read American books, wanted to see what free thought looked like, wanted to glimpse the world beyond the propaganda they'd been fed their entire lives, then she would show them. Because that was her job, that was her calling, and maybe, just maybe, sending these men home with books in their memory instead of just barbed wire and guard towers would do more for peace than any treaty. The room erupted again, but the decision was made. 3 weeks later, on a cold Thursday afternoon in November of 1943, Clara Davenport stood behind her circulation desk and watched through the library's front windows as a military truck pulled up outside. 10 German prisoners climbed out, wearing their PW uniforms, accompanied by 2 armed guards. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing what she would say, how she would maintain professional distance, how she would protect herself from seeing these men as anything other than the enemy they were. But nothing prepared her for their faces when they walked through those doors. She had expected arrogance, defiance, the sneering superiority that newsreels showed. Instead, she saw wonder. Absolute, childlike wonder. The prisoners stopped just inside the entrance, staring at the shelves that lined the walls, at the tables stacked with recent acquisitions, at the card catalog that held the location of every volume. One young man, who couldn't have been more than 22, whispered something in German to the man beside him. The translator, a German-American corporal from the camp, said quietly, "He asks if they are truly allowed to touch the books." Clara had been working in this library for 8 years. She had watched farmers with dirt under their fingernails handle precious volumes with surprising gentleness. She had helped children sound out their first words from picture books. She had recommended novels to grieving widows looking for escape, and biographies to ambitious teenagers dreaming of bigger worlds. But she had never seen anyone look at her books the way these prisoners did in that moment, like they were seeing water after crossing a desert. She cleared her throat and addressed them through the translator, explaining the rules. They could borrow 2 books each for a 2-week period. They needed to handle all materials with care. If they wanted recommendations, they could ask. The guards positioned themselves by the door and near the windows, rifles held loosely but present. And then Clara stepped back and watched as 10 enemy soldiers entered her library and began, cautiously at first, then with growing eagerness, to explore the shelves. They moved through the stacks differently than American patrons, more deliberately, taking books down carefully, reading titles with intense focus, occasionally opening a volume just to run their fingers over the pages. She noticed they kept glancing at the guards, at her, as if expecting this permission to be revoked at any moment, as if the whole thing might be an elaborate trick. One prisoner stood out from the first day, tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses that had been repaired with tape. He moved directly to the literature section. While his fellow prisoners gravitated toward technical manuals, farming guides, and English language instruction books, this man pulled down Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. He opened it to the first page, read a few lines, and Clara saw his entire posture change. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing deepened. He looked like a man who had just heard his native language after years abroad. She learned his name when he brought the book to her desk to check out. Friedrich Weber, former schoolteacher from Hamburg, captured in Tunisia in May of 1943, age 36. The translator explained that Weber taught literature and history before the war. He spoke some English, understood more than he could speak, and wanted to know if he could borrow this book, and also, if possible, something by Mark Twain. Clara found herself recommending Huckleberry Finn before she realized what she was doing. Talking to this man, this enemy, about books as if they were simply 2 readers in a library instead of captor and captive, victor and vanquished. Weber's face lit up when she handed him the Twain. He said, in heavily accented English, "Thank you. I've heard of this book but could never find in Germany. They said it was about freedom. They did not like that word very much." That sentence hung in the air between them. The translator looked uncomfortable. The guards shifted their rifles, and Clara understood with sudden uncomfortable clarity that the propaganda had run both ways. These men had been lied to just as surely as Americans had been fed images of inhuman monsters in Nazi uniforms. They had been told that America was decadent, weak, obsessed with material wealth and devoid of culture. They had been promised that democratic societies were chaotic and doomed to fail. And now they stood in a library in small-town Iowa, surrounded by more books than many of them had ever seen in one place, offered freely to prisoners of war. The routine established itself over the following weeks. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, 10 prisoners at a time, rotating through the camp's population so that hundreds eventually had access. Most came once or twice, borrowing practical books, English textbooks, agricultural guides. But a core group of about 20 became regular visitors, and Friedrich Weber was always among them. Week after week, he worked his way through American literature. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Dos Passos. He asked Clara for recommendations, and she found herself genuinely considering what he would appreciate. He needed her to explain cultural references he didn't understand. Why was The Great Gatsby considered tragic? What did Steinbeck mean by the Dust Bowl? Who was this Walt Whitman who wrote about democracy as if it were something sacred? Those first conversations through the translator felt like speaking through layers of ice, every word carefully chosen, every sentence measured and formal. Clara maintained her professional distance with the same fierce determination she brought to cataloging new acquisitions or tracking overdue books. Friedrich Weber was a prisoner, a German, one of them, and she would not forget that, no matter how carefully he handled her books or how thoughtfully he considered her recommendations. But books have a way of betraying our defenses. They reveal us in the choices we make, in the passages we linger over, in the questions we ask when a story moves us. And Clara, who had spent 2 decades watching readers, could not help but see what Friedrich's selections revealed. After Steinbeck and Twain came Thoreau's Walden, which he read so slowly, she thought he must be translating every word. Then, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which he borrowed twice, returning it with careful notes written in the margins in pencil, notes he apologized profusely for before erasing them completely. He read the Federalist Papers, struggling through the political philosophy, asking her to explain concepts like checks and balances and separation of powers that seemed to genuinely baffle him. One Thursday in January of 1944, he brought back Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here and stood at her desk for a long moment before speaking. His English had improved enough that he no longer needed the translator for simple conversations, though his accent remained thick, and he sometimes paused, searching for the right word. "This book," he said quietly, making sure the guards by the door couldn't hear. "It is about fascism coming to America, yes?" Clara nodded, wondering where this was going. "In Germany," Friedrich continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "we could not read books like this, books that question the government, books that warn about dictators. They burned such books, made bonfires in the streets. I watched them burn books when I was young teacher. I thought then it was necessary to protect Germany from dangerous ideas." He paused, his hands trembling slightly on the circulation desk. "But now I think perhaps it is not dangerous ideas we should fear. Perhaps we should fear the people who want to burn ideas." Clara felt something crack in the careful wall she had built around her heart. This was not the conversation she wanted to have, not with this man, not with any of them. She checked the book back in without responding, her movements brisk and efficient. But that night, alone in her small apartment above the pharmacy, she found herself thinking about Friedrich's words, about what it meant to grow up in a place where asking questions was dangerous, where books were weapons the state feared enough to destroy. The other prisoners revealed themselves through their choices too. Hans Müller, a former farmer from Bavaria, borrowed only agricultural texts, studying American farming methods with the intensity of a graduate student. He told Clara through the translator that Iowa soil reminded him of home, but the machinery here, the tractors and combines, were far beyond anything he had seen in Germany. Carl Schmidt, who had been a mechanic before the war, worked his way through every automotive manual in the library. Sketching diagrams in a notebook, the guards inspected carefully before allowing him to take it back to camp. Young Peter Hoffman, barely 20, borrowed children's books at first, using them to learn English, graduating slowly to novels and eventually to poetry that made him cry openly at the reading tables, tears falling on pages while guards looked uncomfortable, and Clara pretended not to notice. The town watched all of this with varying degrees of horror and fascination. Mrs. Henderson, who had lost her son in the Pacific, made a point of walking past the library every Tuesday and Thursday when the prisoners were there, glaring through the windows with such intensity that Clara worried she might throw a brick through the glass. But she never did. She just watched, her face a mask of grief and rage, bearing witness to what she saw as a betrayal of everything her son had died for. Others were curious despite themselves. Betty Morrison from the post office started coming by on Thursday afternoons, ostensibly to return books, but really to observe the prisoners. She reported back to her customers with a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. "They're so polite," she would say. "Too polite. It's unnerving. They say thank you and please and treat the books like precious things." She couldn't reconcile these quiet, respectful men with the monsters she had imagined. Harold Jensen, the farmer who had spoken so passionately against the library program, hired 6 prisoners to work his fields in the spring of 1944. He needed the labor, and swallowed his pride. But something unexpected happened during those long days of planting. He discovered that several of his workers were the same men he had seen through the library windows. Hans Müller, the Bavarian farmer, proved to be the best hand Jensen had ever hired, understanding instinctively when to rotate crops and how to read the weather. They couldn't speak much to each other beyond gestures and a few words, but they communicated through the universal language of soil and seed and season. By summer, Jensen was telling anyone who would listen that these Germans worked harder than most American boys he had employed, and maybe, just maybe, there was a difference between the Nazi leadership and the ordinary men who had been swept up in that madness. The mathematics of the situation were impossible to ignore. Camp Algona, which had started with 500 prisoners in the summer of 1943, expanded rapidly. By the spring of 1944, it held over 10,000 German prisoners of war, 10,000 men who needed to be fed, housed, guarded, and occupied. 10,000 men who represented an enormous pool of labor at a time when every able-bodied American male was either in uniform or working in a war industry. The prisoners worked on over 150 farms across 3 counties. They worked at the canning factory in Algona, processing vegetables and meat. They cut timber, built roads, and harvested crops. They became essential to keeping Iowa's economy running, and hundreds of them came through Clara's library. The circulation records tell their own story. In the year 1944 alone, German prisoners borrowed over 3,000 books from the Algona Public Library. 3,000 opportunities for minds shaped by Nazi propaganda to encounter different ideas. 3,000 moments where men who had been told that democracy was weak and decadent discovered American authors writing freely about government failures, social injustice, and the messy, complicated reality of freedom. Friedrich Weber became the most prolific borrower of them all. He devoured books the way starving men devoured food. By the summer of 1944, he was reading at a rate that astonished Clara. He would finish a novel in 3 days, a philosophy text in a week, and always he came back with questions. Why did Americans allow books that criticized their own government? How could a society function when people were free to disagree about everything? What was this concept of free speech that seemed to permit even dangerous ideas? Clara found herself setting aside new acquisitions for him. When a shipment arrived from the state library system, she would pull certain volumes before putting them on the shelves. Thoreau's essays, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Lincoln's speeches. She told herself she was just doing her job, providing appropriate materials for a serious reader. But she knew it was more than that. She was teaching him. Deliberately, systematically teaching this German prisoner what America claimed to stand for. And with every book, she saw the transformation happening. It was subtle at first, the way Friedrich began to question things he had previously stated as fact. He mentioned once that he had been taught Jews were responsible for Germany's economic collapse after the First World War. Then, weeks later, after reading about American history and economics, he admitted quietly that perhaps the explanation had been more complicated than his teachers had claimed. Perhaps it had been convenient to blame a minority group rather than examining the Treaty of Versailles, the global depression, and the failures of German leadership. He talked about how he had believed democracy was chaos, that strong leadership required one voice, one vision, one path forward. Then, he read about the American Constitutional Convention, about the arguments and compromises that had forged a nation, about how disagreement and debate had been built into the very structure of government. Why, he asked Clara one afternoon, did the founders want to make governing difficult? Why create a system with so many obstacles to change? She found herself explaining checks and balances, the danger of concentrated power, the idea that a government that could do anything quickly could also do terrible things quickly. That frustration and gridlock were sometimes the price of protecting individual liberty. Friedrich listened with the intensity of a man hearing revolutionary concepts. Because for him, they were revolutionary. Everything he had been taught about government, about society, about what made a nation strong, was being systematically dismantled by the books he borrowed from a small-town Iowa library. The barrier between them eroded so gradually that Clara couldn't identify the exact moment when enemy became simply reader, when prisoner became person. Perhaps it was the afternoon he brought her wildflowers he had picked on the work detail, a small thank you for recommending Emily Dickinson's poetry. The guards made him throw them away before entering the library, but she had seen the gesture. Or perhaps it was the day she learned that Thomas had died at Normandy, and she came to work anyway because she didn't know what else to do, and Friedrich saw her red eyes and asked gently if she was well, and she snapped at him that it was none of his concern, and he nodded and said simply, "I am sorry for your losses, all of them, on all sides." That night she went home and cried for hours, not just for Thomas, though God knew she grieved him with every fiber of her being, but also for the impossibility of it all. How could she mourn her fiancé, killed by Germans, while spending her afternoons teaching a German prisoner to appreciate American literature? How could she hold her hatred close while watching that same man handle books with reverence, his face lighting up when he discovered a new author, his questions growing more sophisticated and thoughtful with each visit? Her brother James would have said she was betraying Thomas's memory. Many in town already whispered it behind her back. But Clara thought about her father's words, "Don't let hate make you small." And she thought about what Thomas himself had written in his last letter, received 2 weeks after his death. He had told her that he was fighting not just to defeat an enemy, but to defend an idea. That America meant something. That freedom of thought and expression were worth dying for. Would it honor his sacrifice, she wondered, to withhold those very freedoms from prisoners who had never known them? By the autumn of 1944, something remarkable had happened in Algona. The library had become neutral territory, a demilitarized zone in the middle of a world war. The prisoners who came there regularly were known by name to Clara and to the regular patrons who had stopped avoiding the building on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Conversations happened, stilted and careful at first, then gradually more natural. Mrs. Morrison from the post office discovered that Peter Hoffman had been a baker's apprentice before the war, and they discussed recipes through a combination of gestures, broken English, and the translator's assistance. Mr. Chen, who ran the grocery and had himself immigrated from China 30 years earlier, talked with Carl Schmidt about what it meant to be foreign in America, to be viewed with suspicion, but also to find unexpected kindness. The transformation Clara had witnessed in Friedrich was not unique, though his was perhaps the most profound. Across the camp, she saw it reflected in dozens of prisoners who had discovered something unexpected in their captivity. But none of this prepared her for what she would find on a cold November afternoon in 1945, when the war in Europe had been over for 6 months and the repatriation process was finally beginning. The camp was emptying in waves. Groups of prisoners processed through, receiving paperwork, turning in their American-issued work clothes, preparing for the long journey back to a Germany that existed now only in ruins. Hamburg, where Friedrich had taught school, had been bombed into rubble. Dresden was ash. Berlin was divided among occupying forces. The men were going home to a homeland that no longer existed in any form they would recognize. Clara had watched them leave, week after week, trying not to feel the weight of each goodbye. These were prisoners, enemies. She should be relieved to see them go. Instead, she felt a strange grief, as if something precious was being dismantled. Friedrich was scheduled to leave on a Tuesday, which seemed fitting. Tuesday had been one of his library days for 2 years. Clara knew he would come to return his books one final time, but she wasn't prepared for how she would feel when she saw him walk through the door. He looked thinner than usual, worn down by the uncertainty of what awaited him. He carried 3 books, which he placed gently on her desk. 2 volumes of Emerson's essays and the battered copy of Walden that he had borrowed and renewed more times than any other book in his 2 years of visits. "I wanted to finish this one more time," he said in English that was nearly fluent now, tinged with an accent but clear and confident, "before I go home, or what is left of home." Clara checked the books in, her hands performing the familiar motions while her mind struggled with what to say. Thank you seemed absurd. Good luck felt inadequate. I'll miss our conversations was too honest, too dangerous. So she said nothing, just stamped the date and made her notations in the ledger. Friedrich stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for something. Then he nodded once, formal and distant again, like that first day 2 years ago, and turned to leave. She watched him walk toward the door, past the shelves he had explored so thoroughly, past the reading table where he had spent hundreds of hours. He paused at the door, looked back once, and then he was gone. It wasn't until evening, after the library had closed and Clara was processing the day's returns, that she found the note. She was checking Walden for damage, a routine part of her workflow, when she felt the irregularity in the binding. Pages 97 and 98, where Thoreau wrote about solitude and self-reliance, where the spine had been opened and closed so many times that it naturally fell open to that spot. The paper was folded with such precision that it lay flat against the page, nearly invisible. She unfolded it carefully, her librarian's instinct to preserve even as her hands trembled slightly. The handwriting was immaculate, Friedrich's teaching hand, every letter formed with deliberate care. The note was 3 pages long, written in English, dated November 14th, 1945. It began simply, "Dear Mrs. Davenport." She had never told him about Thomas, about her fiancé who died at Normandy. But somehow he knew she was Mrs., a courtesy title afforded to older unmarried women, and he used it with respect. What followed was a confession, a testimony, and a promise that would change everything Clara thought she understood about the power of books and the nature of redemption. Friedrich wrote that he had been a true believer, not a reluctant soldier drafted into service, but a genuine Nazi who had embraced the ideology with the fervor of the educated and the convinced. He had believed in German superiority, in the Führer's vision, in the necessity of war to restore Germany to its rightful place. He had taught these ideas to children. He had reported colleagues who expressed doubts. He had cheered when books were burned because he believed, truly believed, that dangerous ideas had weakened Germany, and only by controlling thought could the nation be saved. Then came capture in Tunisia, the long journey to America, and the arrival at Camp Algona expecting brutality. He wrote about his first visit to the library, how he had been certain it was a trap or a trick, that the Americans would let them see the books but not touch them, or would stock the shelves with propaganda, or would monitor what they read and punish wrong choices. Instead, he found a library that held books critical of the American government, books about American failures and injustices, books that questioned authority and challenged power, books that, in Germany, would have earned their authors a trip to a concentration camp. "I could not understand it at first," he wrote. "Why would a nation at war allow its prisoners to read books that exposed its weaknesses? Why would you give me Sinclair Lewis, who warned about fascism in America? Why would you recommend Upton Sinclair, who wrote about corporate greed and government corruption? In Germany, we learned that strong nations controlled information, shaped thought, permitted only messages that strengthened the state. But here, you did the opposite. And slowly, I began to understand. You were not afraid of ideas, not even ideas that criticized you. And I realized that perhaps true strength is not in controlling what people think, but in trusting them to think freely." The note went on for pages. Friedrich described how each book had chipped away at his certainty. How Steinbeck's portrayal of poverty in America had shown him that even wealthy nations struggled with injustice, but they wrote about it, published it, taught it in schools. How Mark Twain's satire had revealed a culture comfortable enough to laugh at itself. How Thoreau's civil disobedience had introduced him to the radical idea that individuals had not just the right, but the duty to resist unjust laws. How the Federalist Papers had shown him that the American founders had designed a government that was difficult to control precisely because they feared what concentrated power could become. "Every book was a hammer blow to the lies I had been taught," he wrote, "and you, Mrs. Davenport, you treated me not as a monster but as a reader. You recommended books as if I were worthy of ideas. You answered my questions with patience even when I asked foolish things. You showed me dignity I did not deserve. And I want you to know that this changed me, not just my mind, but my soul. I will return to Germany, to whatever is left of it, and I will teach again if I can. But I will teach differently. I will teach what I learned in your library. That freedom of thought is not weakness, but strength. That nations confident in their values do not need to burn books. That treating even enemies with humanity is not surrender, but the highest form of victory." Clara's hands shook as she read. Tears blurred the words. This was what she had hoped for without daring to name it, that books could do more than entertain or inform, that they could actually transform minds, break through indoctrination, plant seeds that would grow into wisdom. But the note wasn't finished. On the third page, Friedrich revealed something that made her heart stop. He had been writing. For 18 months, he had been documenting his observations about American life, about democracy, about the lessons he was learning through books and through interactions with the people of Algona. He had filled 3 notebooks with these observations, written in German, hidden in his barracks. And he had done something audacious. He had given these notebooks to Colonel Miller, asking that they be forwarded to Clara as a gift, a testimony, and a teaching tool. They would arrive, he wrote, after he had left, so that no one could accuse him of attempting to use them for any purpose except their true intent, to document his transformation and to serve as evidence that even the most convinced Nazi could be reached through knowledge, dignity, and patience. I do not know what will become of Germany, the note concluded, but I know what I will try to become. A teacher who teaches students to question, to think, to read widely and critically. I will tell them about an American library that gave books to prisoners, about a librarian who treated me with respect I had not earned, about a nation so strong it could afford to show mercy to its enemies. This is what I learned in Algona, Iowa, and this is what I will carry home. Thank you, Mrs. Davenport. Thank you for every book. Thank you for showing me what I had been missing in my certainty. A nation that gives books to its prisoners fears neither truth nor its enemies. Clara sat at her desk until long after dark, reading the note over and over. She thought about Thomas, about what he would think of this. She thought about her father's words about not letting hate make you small. She thought about Friedrich Weber, former Nazi, true believer, now carrying American ideas back to the ruins of Germany. And she wept, for Thomas and for Friedrich, for all the young men on both sides who had been caught up in the madness of war, and for the strange, fragile possibility of redemption. The notebooks arrived a week later. 3 leather-bound journals filled with Friedrich's neat handwriting, all in German. Colonel Miller included a note explaining that the camp's intelligence officers had reviewed the contents and found nothing that violated security protocols. They were simply the observations of a thoughtful man grappling with ideas that challenged everything he had been taught. The colonel's note added, Mrs. Davenport, I thought you should know that we've had 1,700 prisoners go through the library program at Camp Algona. We've tracked their behavior, their work performance, their interactions with American civilians. The men who participated in the library program had dramatically lower discipline problems, higher work productivity, and significantly more positive attitudes. Several have asked to immigrate back to America after the required waiting period. This was an experiment in treating enemy prisoners as human beings capable of change. Your work here has been the centerpiece of that experiment, and I believe it has succeeded beyond our hopes. Clara knew she needed to share this. The note, the notebooks, the evidence that this strange experiment in wartime libraries had actually worked. She started with the library board, reading them Friedrich's note at their December meeting. The room fell silent as she read. Margaret Hoffman wept openly. Reverend Clayton said a quiet prayer of thanksgiving, but Harold Jensen, whose son had come home from Italy missing an arm, sat stone-faced and said, "It's nice that one Nazi found some books he liked, doesn't bring back the boys who died." The Algona newspaper ran the story on the front page. Local library changes enemy soldier's heart. It was picked up by the Des Moines Register, then by the Wire Services. Within weeks, newspapers across America were running stories about the German prisoner who had been transformed by an Iowa library. Clara received dozens of letters. Some praised her, calling her a patriot who had demonstrated American values. Others condemned her, accusing her of coddling the enemy while American boys died. But the letters that meant the most came from other librarians, dozens of them, working in communities near the more than 400 prisoner of war camps scattered across America. They wrote to tell Clara that they had similar programs, similar transformations, similar stories of enemy soldiers discovering that America was nothing like the propaganda had promised. A librarian in Texas wrote about a prisoner who had wept when he realized he could read Karl Marx in America, a book banned in Nazi Germany. A librarian in Wisconsin described a prisoner who had asked, in broken English, why Americans were not afraid of letting people read whatever they wanted. The answer, she had told him, was simple. Truth does not fear questions. The broader picture was emerging. Camp Algona was just one installation among hundreds. By the war's end, America held over 400,000 German prisoners, scattered across every state. The policy of humane treatment according to Geneva Convention standards was not an accident or an act of sentiment. It was calculated strategy. Feed them well, treat them fairly, show them what democracy actually looked like, and send them home as living testimonies to American values. The numbers told a story that propaganda never could. Prisoners received 2,800 calories per day when American civilians were rationed to 2,400. They were paid 80 cents daily for their labor, which they could spend in camp canteens on cigarettes, candy, soap, and writing materials. They attended classes, formed orchestras, published camp newspapers, and they wrote letters home describing conditions that their families in bombed-out German cities could scarcely believe. Camp Algona specifically had become a model for the prisoner of war program. By 1944, it held 10,400 prisoners across the main camp and 34 branch camps spread across 3 counties. They worked on farms, in canneries, in lumber yards. They generated millions of dollars in labor value for Iowa's economy, while millions of American men fought overseas. The library program that Clara oversaw became part of the camp's educational initiative, which also included English classes, vocational training, and even college-level courses taught by prisoners who had been university professors before the war. Friedrich's notebooks were eventually translated and donated to the Iowa Historical Society. They provided remarkable documentation of a mind being changed, almost in real time. Early entries showed his confusion and suspicion. Why were Americans so wasteful? Why did they allow such disorder in their government? Why did they seem to care more about individual freedom than collective strength? But as the months progressed, the tone shifted. He began to question his assumptions. He started to see that what looked like weakness, the constant debate, the criticism of leaders, the messy process of democracy, might actually be a different kind of strength. A strength rooted not in the power of the state, but in the resilience of free people. One passage from his notebooks became particularly famous after it was published in a historical journal years later. He had written, "Today I asked Mrs. Davenport why American libraries allow anyone to enter, even the poor, even immigrants who speak no English, even prisoners of war. In Germany, our finest libraries required membership, fees, proof of education. Only the worthy could access knowledge. She looked at me as if I had asked why people need air to breathe, because knowledge is not a privilege," she said. "It is a right. And a nation that hoards knowledge from its people is a nation that fears its people. I am beginning to understand that Germany did not lose this war on the battlefield alone. We lost it in our libraries, in our schools, in every place where we decided that truth was too dangerous for ordinary people to handle." The story gradually faded from the headlines as 1945 turned to 1946, and America faced the massive task of bringing millions of soldiers home and converting back to a peacetime economy. Clara continued her work at the library, but she was changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. She created a special collection, a section she called Books That Build Bridges, featuring the volumes that had been most popular with the German prisoners. She wrote careful catalog cards explaining the significance of each book, creating a living memorial to the strange experiment in wartime reading. Thomas Mitchell's death remained a wound that never fully healed, but Clara found a way to honor his memory that felt true to who he had been. Thomas had believed America was worth fighting for because of its ideals, not just its territory. He had died defending the freedom to think, to read, to question. And Clara had shown that freedom to men who had never known it. That felt like a continuation of his sacrifice, not a betrayal of it. The years passed. 1946 became 1950. The Korean War came and went, Camp Algona was dismantled, the barracks sold off, the land returned to farming. The guard towers came down, the barbed wire was rolled up and hauled away. Within a few years, only the memories remained, and a small museum in town dedicated to preserving the camp's history. But some connections proved more durable than barbed wire. Clara began receiving letters from Germany in 1948. The first was from Friedrich Weber. He had survived the journey home, though barely. Hamburg was unrecognizable. His school was rubble. His apartment building no longer existed. His wife had died in the bombing of 1943, information that had never reached him in captivity. His sister had survived and was living in the British occupation zone. He had found work teaching in a school run by the American occupation forces, and he was using everything he had learned in Iowa. The letters continued, one every few months for decades. Friedrich described the slow, painful rebuilding of Germany. He wrote about teaching students who had grown up under Nazism, trying to help them understand what had gone wrong, how a civilized nation had descended into barbarism. He told Clara that he used his experience in her library as a teaching tool. He would tell his students, "I was a Nazi. I believed in the Reich. I thought we were superior and that democracy was weak. Then I was captured and sent to America, and a librarian gave me books that challenged everything I believed. She treated me with dignity when she had every reason to hate me. And those books, that dignity, changed my life." Other former prisoners from Camp Algona wrote too. Hans Muller, the Bavarian farmer, immigrated back to America in 1952. He settled in Iowa, bought a farm near Algona, and became an American citizen. He stopped by the library sometimes, always polite, always grateful, showing Clara pictures of his children born in American hospitals, attending American schools. Carl Schmidt, the mechanic, opened an auto repair shop in Des Moines. Peter Hoffman, who had cried over poetry, became a translator for the State Department. The prisoners who had worked Iowa farms, who had learned American methods, who had been treated with rough fairness by farmers desperate for help, many of them came back. Not as prisoners, but as immigrants, choosing to build their futures in the country that had once held them captive. By the 1960s, historians were beginning to study the prisoner of war program seriously. The statistics were remarkable. Of the more than 400,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Discipline problems were minimal compared to camps in other countries, and most significantly, thousands returned to America as legal immigrants after the required waiting period. They became farmers, engineers, professors, small business owners. They married American women, raised American children, and carried with them a unique perspective on what had transformed them from enemies into citizens. The economics of reconciliation proved just as powerful as the personal stories. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe after the war, succeeded partly because Americans and Germans could work together. The German prisoners who had returned home carried with them knowledge of American methods, American attitudes, and American generosity. They became informal ambassadors, helping to bridge the gap between former enemies who now needed to become allies against the Soviet threat. The investments America made in treating prisoners humanely, in showing them democracy rather than just telling them about it, paid dividends that no one could have predicted in the dark days of 1943. Then came 1968, 23 years after the war's end. Clara was 64 years old, planning her retirement from the library she had served for 33 years. She received a letter from Friedrich in April, informing her that he was coming to America. He had been invited to speak at several universities about post-war German education and the denazification process. But the real reason for his trip, he wrote, was to visit Algona, to see the library again, to thank her in person for what she had done. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in June, which seemed appropriate. The library looked much the same, though it had been expanded and modernized. Clara was waiting when his taxi pulled up. She had wondered if she would recognize him after more than 2 decades, but when he stepped out of the car, she knew him immediately. He was older, grayer, wearing glasses and a proper suit. But his eyes held the same intensity she remembered, that hunger for knowledge and understanding that had made him such an extraordinary reader. They stood facing each other on the library steps, former prisoner and former librarian, German and American, two people whose lives had intersected in the strangest of circumstances and had been forever changed by that intersection. Friedrich spoke first. "Mrs. Davenport, thank you for seeing me." "It's Miss Davenport, actually," Clara said softly. "I never married, and please, call me Clara." They went inside, and she showed him how the library had grown. The children's section was twice as large. They had added a reference room and a small auditorium. But the literature section, the stacks where he had spent so many hours, those remained in the same location. He ran his hand along the spines, pulling down books he remembered. The Steinbeck was still there, rebound but the same edition. The Thoreau had been replaced, too worn out from constant use, but Clara had saved the old copy. She had saved it for him.